I'm John Lentz, City and State's Albany Bureau Chief. Joining me today is Christie Peale, Executive Director of the Center for New York City Neighborhoods. It's a nonprofit focused on affordable home ownership. And it's 2 years after Hurricane Sandy hit New York City. And there's obviously been a lot of issues with rebuilding, how fast that's going. But one issue your organization is looking at is rising flood insurance rates. Tell me what the problem is, what you propose doing.
Sure. So there are two major factors at play here. FEMA radically restructured the National Flood Insurance Program right before Sandy actually hit. And in addition to that, New York City has been operating under what are called flood maps from 1983. So we all thought that we were pretty safe, and then when Sandy hit and we realized that there are huge swaths of the city that needed to be covered by flood insurance, it really was a rude awakening for all of us. And to have FEMA restructure the program at the same time, eliminating a lot of these historic subsidies that have been in place for previous disasters, it meant that a lot of homeowners in New York City were at huge risk for rising rates. So in the high-risk flood zone, and you can find out where you are on the maps by going to floodhelpny.org. In the high-risk zones, folks can see rates starting to increase in 2016 by anywhere from 17%, and depending on your experience with Sandy or Irene, it could go up to 25%. A lot of the homeowners and properties in some of the coastal neighborhoods in Brooklyn and Queens and Staten Island were also heavily hit by the foreclosure crisis. So there's a lot of household mortgage distress, as we call it, in these neighborhoods.
Sure, and just to clarify then, so part of the issue is the new federal flood maps cover more area,
Exactly.
But also you said subsidies were cut even before Sandy.
Right. So the National Flood Insurance Program, it has been a really important part of disaster recovery for many, many years. And in a lot of areas, folks were not adequately insured. So when disaster struck, they would have to pay out, FEMA paid out a tremendous number of claims. And the program was in real financial trouble. So they had to borrow money from Treasury. And as a result, the federal government has been working really hard to try and make the program more financially sound. So, those are really important goals, and obviously we support that. But we think in New York City, there needs to be a very specific lens put on how we do resiliency here and how we price risk and how we keep families safe.
And specifically with the new federal flood maps that cover more of New York City, I think FEMA got some criticism in the wake of the storm that the maps were not accurate enough. There's some real issues, some reporting on that. Should they be expanding this? Is that in of itself an issue that they're covering more area that might be vulnerable?
Well,
floods?
I think there's real progress here. If you look at the maps of the areas that were flooded by Sandy and what are called the new 2016 maps, you'll see that they pretty much match. So they have done a good job of accurately predicting if there was another Sandy, God forbid, they would be hitting the right properties. The problem is these maps, which are called the 2016 maps, they don't take into account climate change. So as sea levels rise, there are more properties that could be at risk. Mm-hmm. So that's why it's really critical that we come up with a plan that works for New York City neighborhoods and homeowners now.
And what are some of the potential solutions, or what should be done differently?
Well, one of the things that FEMA could do is look at alternative mitigation measures. So in New York, we have really, in some neighborhoods in the flood zone, we have really solid housing stock, right? Brick, often attached homes. These are not insubstantial properties, but they're very difficult to elevate, right? A very typical way that you avoid increased flood rates is to elevate your home, thereby, reducing the risk. But we think that FEMA could adopt these interim measures, which would take into account our dense and older housing stock. So that's one great way. Some of the other things that they could do is really take an intense look at the affordability impacts of rising flood insurance. And I know the city has done a lot to take the lead on that, but FEMA is doing their own studies. So a real understanding of the affordability impacts of increased rates would help us be able to make the cost-benefit analysis of, well, maybe we do want to ask for need-based subsidies. So there's a number of different options. We could also think about putting money aside to help people borrow cheaper funds to elevate if they can elevate. We're working with all of our partners in government to come up with some other ideas.
Right, and just today, the city controller put out a report with some recommendations on this. Did you have a chance to look at that?
I'm so happy that we now have another, partner in this fight with Comptroller Stringer. And one of the things that, there are two things about the report that are critical. First of all, he draws attention to the vast number of properties. As I alluded before, there are 200,000 people were in the high-risk floodplain before, and it's probably 400,000 now. I mean, that's a huge number of New Yorkers. And he also called attention to the potential value of properties at risk, which is a huge number. But one of the things that he talked about, which has also been advocated by the governor's office of storm recovery, is this idea that if you're doing infrastructure improvements, such as putting in a seawall, changing stormwater waste management, dealing with dunes and other sort of environmentally based remediation, then the city as a whole should be able to benefit from those increased resiliency measures. So that should impact the rates as well.
And in the view of your organization, what role is there to just abandoning properties? I know that's been in discussion ever since Sandy. I just heard on the radio today a report about someone who tried to rebuild their home and then just gave up, took the buyout. And I mean, is that a reasonable path forward in some of these areas?
Well, that's actually another option that we talk about in our report, rising tides and rising costs. There need to be viable buyout options, but buyout options really do need to take into consideration the affordability issues that I mentioned before and mortgage distress. So that homeowner was lucky enough to be able to pay off his mortgage and be able to afford a new place down in Florida. But in many cases, if you've been behind in your mortgage for years, you have a lot of debt and arrears, you may not be able to get enough from the assessed value of your property to be able to pay it off and find a new place to live. So, viable buyout options include an understanding of, where people are going to go. And I think that the city as a whole just needs to think about what it means to be losing lower middle income families in large numbers and be able to say, what do we want for the future of the city? So if people have to leave New York, that's a really tough situation for us all to deal with, but we might want to think about other options to create new housing opportunities.
Christie Peale, thanks for joining us today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having us.